The dust kicked up from Jake Morrison's boots as he walked across the main street of Cedar Falls, Texas. It was June 15, 2019, and the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the small town that had been his home for 43 years. Jake owned the largest cattle ranch in the county, spanning over 8,000 acres of prime Texas land that his grandfather had bought back in 1952. Jake was not a man people crossed lightly. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with broad shoulders built from decades of ranch work, he had a reputation for getting his way. His weathered face told the story of countless hours under the Texas sun, and his piercing blue eyes could make grown men uncomfortable. Most folks in Cedar Falls knew to step aside when Jake Morrison had business to attend to. But today was different. Today, Jake was angry about something that had been eating at him for months. The source of his frustration was a small piece of land right in the middle of his property that he didn't own. It belonged to Maria Santos, a 60-year-old widow who had inherited the 20-acre plot from her late husband Carlos. Maria's land was like a thorn in Jake's side. Her property sat right where he wanted to build a new cattle processing facility that would increase his ranch's profits by hundreds of thousands of dollars each year. He had offered to buy the land from Maria multiple times, starting with what he considered a fair price of $50,000. When she refused, he increased his offer to $75,000, then $100,000. Each time Maria politely declined. She explained that the land held too many memories of her late husband, who had worked every inch of those 20 acres with his own hands. Carlos had planted fruit trees there, built a small house where they raised their 3 children, and created a garden that still bloomed with vegetables and flowers. Maria simply could not bring herself to sell the place where she had been happiest. Jake couldn't understand her reasoning. To him, land was business. It was money. It was opportunity. The fact that a small woman was standing in the way of his expansion plans frustrated him beyond measure. He had built his ranch into the most successful operation in 3 counties by never taking no for an answer. The situation became more complicated when Jake learned that Maria's son Miguel was helping her maintain the property. Miguel was 35 years old and worked as a mechanic in the nearby town of Millerville. Every weekend, he drove the 40 miles to help his mother with repairs, yard work, and anything else she needed. Jake saw Miguel as another obstacle to his plans. He had heard from other ranchers that Miguel was encouraging his mother not to sell. This information, whether true or not, made Jake's anger burn even hotter. He began to see the Santos family as people who were deliberately trying to hurt his business. 3 months earlier, Jake had tried a different approach. He went to the county courthouse and researched Maria's property records, looking for any legal way to force her to sell. He discovered that there was an old easement agreement from 1967 that gave his ranch access to a water source that ran through Maria's land. The agreement stated that Morrison Ranch had the right to maintain and use a cattle path that crossed the northwest corner of Maria's property. Jake's lawyer, Robert Mitchell, examined the easement documents and confirmed that they were still legally valid. However, Robert warned Jake that the easement only gave him the right to cross the land with cattle, not to harass the property owner or demand that she sell. Robert strongly advised Jake to continue trying to negotiate with Maria in a respectful manner. But Jake was running out of patience. His business partners were pressuring him to finalize the location for the new processing facility. If he couldn't secure Maria's land, he would have to find an alternative location that would be less convenient and more expensive. The delay was costing him money every day. 2 weeks ago, Jake decided to take matters into his own hands. He began using the old cattle path more frequently than necessary, sometimes driving his pickup truck along the route instead of just moving cattle. He told himself that he had every legal right to use the easement, but deep down he knew he was trying to make life difficult for Maria. Maria noticed the increased activity on her land and politely asked Jake to limit his use of the path to actual cattle drives. She explained that the noise and dust from his truck were disturbing her vegetable garden and frightening her chickens. Jake responded by telling her that he would use his legal easement however he saw fit. The tension between Jake and Maria escalated when Maria installed a small gate across the cattle path. The gate was designed to allow cattle to pass through while preventing vehicles from using the route. Maria had every right to install the gate as long as it didn't interfere with the legitimate use of the easement for moving cattle. Jake saw the gate as a declaration of war. He arrived at Maria's property the next morning with a pair of bolt cutters and removed the gate entirely. When Maria confronted him about this, Jake told her that she had no right to interfere with his easement. Maria called the sheriff's office to report the incident. Sheriff Tom Bradley was a fair man who had known both Jake and Maria for many years. He drove out to Maria's property to investigate the dispute. After examining the easement documents and listening to both sides of the story, Sheriff Bradley told Jake that he could use the path for cattle but could not remove Maria's gate if it didn't interfere with legitimate cattle drives. Jake was furious at what he saw as the sheriff taking sides against him. He had contributed significant money to Sheriff Bradley's re-election campaign and expected more support. That evening, Jake called several of his wealthy friends and complained about the sheriff's handling of the situation. He suggested that maybe it was time for Cedar Falls to have a new sheriff. The conflict reached a boiling point last week when Maria's grandson Diego came to visit. Diego was 22 years old and had recently graduated from Texas A&M University with a degree in agricultural engineering. He was spending the summer helping his grandmother before starting his first job in the fall. Diego was bright, educated, and confident in a way that immediately rubbed Jake the wrong way. When Diego suggested that his grandmother could develop her 20 acres into a small organic farm that would be more profitable than selling to Jake, the older rancher felt personally insulted. How dare this young college kid tell him about land use and profitability? Yesterday, the situation exploded into open conflict. Jake was moving a herd of cattle across Maria's land when he encountered Diego repairing the gate that Jake had previously destroyed. The young man was using a welding torch to reinforce the gate's hinges and make it more durable. "What do you think you're doing?" Jake demanded as he climbed down from his horse. Diego looked up from his work and smiled politely. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison. I'm just fixing grandmother's gate. The design will allow your cattle to pass through easily while keeping vehicles out." "I don't need some college boy telling me how to move my cattle," Jake replied, his voice rising in anger. "I'm not telling you anything about your cattle," Diego responded calmly. "I'm just maintaining my grandmother's property." The exchange continued to escalate as Jake became more aggressive and Diego remained respectfully firm. Other ranchers who were helping with the cattle drive watched the confrontation with growing concern. They could see that Jake was losing his temper in a way that might lead to trouble. Finally, Jake made a statement that shocked everyone present: "Your family has been nothing but a problem for this community. Maybe it's time you people learned your place." The racist undertone of Jake's comment hung in the air like smoke. Diego's expression changed from polite confusion to quiet anger. The other ranchers shifted uncomfortably, knowing that their boss had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Excuse me?" Diego said, setting down his welding torch and standing to face Jake directly. Jake realized he had said something he shouldn't have, but his pride prevented him from backing down. Instead, he doubled down on his aggressive stance. "You heard me, boy. This is how things work around here." What happened next would be talked about in Cedar Falls for years to come. Diego, who had never been in a fight in his life, made a decision that would change everything. He had spent 4 years studying engineering, but he had also spent every summer working construction jobs to pay for college. His hands were strong from manual labor, and his reflexes were quick from playing college baseball. "Mr. Morrison," Diego said quietly, "I think you should apologize to my grandmother and leave our property." Jake's face turned red with rage. He had never been challenged by someone he considered beneath him, especially not someone so young. The fact that this confrontation was happening in front of his employees made it even more humiliating. "I don't apologize to anyone," Jake snarled, stepping closer to Diego. "Especially not to some punk kid who doesn't know his place." The other ranchers could see what was about to happen. Some of them started moving closer, hoping to prevent a physical confrontation. But they were too late. Jake Morrison, in his anger and pride, was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. The afternoon sun continued to beat down on the small piece of land that had caused so much trouble. Neither Jake nor Diego knew that Maria was watching from her kitchen window, her phone in her hand, ready to call for help if needed. Neither of them knew that Jake's wife Linda was driving toward Maria's property, hoping to apologize for her husband's recent behavior and find a peaceful solution to the dispute. And neither of them knew that a local newspaper reporter named Sarah Chen was driving past on the nearby county road, her camera ready to document what she thought would be a simple story about land disputes in rural Texas. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change multiple lives forever. Jake Morrison was about to learn that crossing certain lines comes with consequences he never imagined. And Diego Santos was about to discover that sometimes standing up for what's right requires more courage than he knew he possessed. The tension in the air was thick as both men stood facing each other, surrounded by dust, cattle, and the weight of months of accumulated anger and frustration. In a few moments, everything would change. The rancher who had always gotten his way was about to meet someone who refused to be intimidated. Jake Morrison raised his hand, not knowing that within seconds, he would be on the ground, and his life would never be the same. Jake Morrison's hand was halfway through its arc when Diego Santos moved with a speed that surprised everyone watching. The young man stepped slightly to his left, grabbed Jake's wrist with his right hand, and used the rancher's own momentum to send him stumbling forward. It was a basic self-defense move that Diego had learned in a college safety course, but he executed it perfectly. Jake, caught completely off guard by Diego's quick reaction, lost his balance and crashed face-first into the dirt. The sound of his body hitting the ground was loud enough to startle the nearby cattle. Dust flew up around him as he lay there, more shocked than hurt, trying to understand what had just happened. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake's ranch hands stood frozen, unable to believe that their intimidating boss was lying in the dirt, brought down by a young man who looked like he had never been in a fight. Diego stepped back, his hands raised in a peaceful gesture, clearly not wanting to continue the confrontation. "Mr. Morrison, are you okay?" Diego asked, his voice steady but concerned. Despite everything that had happened, he didn't want to see the older man seriously hurt. Jake slowly pushed himself up to his knees, spitting dirt from his mouth. His face was red from embarrassment and rage. In 43 years of getting his way through intimidation, nothing like this had ever happened to him. He had been humiliated in front of his own employees by someone he considered inferior. "You little punk," Jake growled, struggling to his feet. "You have no idea what you just did." But before Jake could make another move, the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air. Sheriff Tom Bradley's patrol car was coming up the dirt road, followed closely by a white sedan that belonged to Linda Morrison, Jake's wife. Behind them came a small blue car driven by Sarah Chen, the reporter who had been passing by when she noticed the commotion. Sheriff Bradley stepped out of his car and immediately assessed the situation. He could see Jake brushing dirt off his clothes, Diego standing with his hands still raised, and the ranch hands looking extremely uncomfortable. Years of law enforcement experience told him exactly what had happened. "Gentlemen, what seems to be the problem here?" Sheriff Bradley asked in his calm, authoritative voice. Jake's first instinct was to demand that Diego be arrested for assault. But, as he opened his mouth to speak, he realized how the situation would look. He was a grown man who outweighed Diego by 50 pounds, and he was the one who had ended up on the ground. His pride simply couldn't handle admitting that he had been bested by someone so young. "Just a misunderstanding, Sheriff," Jake mumbled, avoiding eye contact with Bradley. Linda Morrison approached her husband with a mixture of concern and embarrassment. She had heard about the escalating conflict with Maria Santos and had come to try to smooth things over. Seeing her husband covered in dirt and clearly agitated, she knew the situation had gotten much worse than she had feared. "Jake, what happened?" Linda asked quietly. Before Jake could answer, Maria Santos came hurrying out of her house. She had watched the entire confrontation from her kitchen window and was deeply upset by what she had seen. Despite all the tension between her family and Jake Morrison, she didn't want anyone to get hurt on her property. "Sheriff Bradley," Maria said breathlessly, "I saw everything." "Mr. Morrison tried to hit my grandson, and Diego was just defending himself." Sarah Chen, the reporter, had been quietly taking photos and notes from a distance. She recognized the potential significance of this story, a wealthy rancher being brought down by a college student in a dispute over land rights. It was exactly the kind of human interest story that her newspaper loved to publish. Sheriff Bradley looked around at all the faces and made a decision. I think everyone needs to calm down and step back. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to ask you to leave Mrs. Santos' property. Diego, you're not in any trouble, but I'd appreciate it if you'd go inside with your grandmother. Jake's face grew even redder. Sheriff, this boy assaulted me. I demand you arrest him. From what I can see, Sheriff Bradley replied calmly, you have dirt on your clothes and he doesn't have a mark on him. If you want to file a complaint, we can do that, but I'd need to hear from all the witnesses first. Jake looked around at his ranch hands. He could see in their faces that they would tell the truth about what had happened, that he had tried to hit Diego first. The prospect of having his humiliation documented in an official police report was more than his pride could bear. Forget it, Jake muttered. Let's go, boys. But, as Jake turned to walk back to his horse, Sarah Chen stepped forward. Mr. Morrison, I'm Sarah Chen from the Cedar Falls Gazette. Could I ask you a few questions about this land dispute? Jake's blood pressure shot even higher. The last thing he wanted was newspaper coverage of this incident. No comment, he said sharply, but Sarah was already taking notes. What about you, Mr. Santos? Sarah asked, turning to Diego. Would you like to share your side of the story? Diego looked uncertainly at his grandmother, who nodded encouragingly. I just want people to know that my family isn't trying to cause trouble for anyone. We just want to keep the land that has been in our family for over 50 years. Linda Morrison approached Maria Santos while the others were talking. The two women had known each other casually for years, and Linda felt deeply embarrassed by her husband's behavior. Maria, I'm so sorry about all this, Linda said quietly. Jake has been under a lot of stress with the business, but that's no excuse for what happened today. Maria nodded graciously. I understand, Linda. I just wish we could find a way to resolve this peacefully. Maybe there is a way, Linda replied thoughtfully. What if Jake built his processing facility somewhere else on the ranch? I know it would be more expensive, but it might be worth it to end this conflict. Meanwhile, Jake was dealing with the uncomfortable stares of his ranch hands. These men had worked for him for years and had always respected his authority. But seeing him laid low by a young college student had changed something fundamental in their relationship with him. Boss, said Tom Rodriguez, Jake's foreman, maybe we should head back to the main ranch. We can finish moving these cattle later. Jake nodded curtly, not trusting himself to speak. As he climbed back onto his horse, he could feel the eyes of everyone watching him. The humiliation burned in his chest like acid. But Jake Morrison was not the type of man to accept defeat gracefully. As he rode away from Maria's property, his mind was already working on ways to get revenge. He had money, influence, and connections throughout the county. Surely there was some way to make the Santos family pay for this humiliation. His first thought was to use his political connections to cause problems for Maria's property. Perhaps there were building code violations or tax issues that could be pursued. Maybe he could pressure the county to condemn the land for some public project. His second thought was to make life difficult for Diego professionally. Jake knew people throughout the agricultural industry in Texas. A few phone calls might be enough to ensure that the young man had trouble finding work after graduation. But, as these thoughts of revenge swirled through his mind, Jake failed to consider several important factors. First, Sarah Chen was already writing her story, and it would paint him in a very unfavorable light. Second, several of his ranch hands were beginning to question whether they wanted to continue working for a man who would try to hit someone half his age. And, third, his wife Linda was seriously considering taking matters into her own hands to resolve the dispute. Back at Maria's property, Sheriff Bradley was finishing his investigation. He had spoken to all the witnesses and was satisfied that Diego had acted in self-defense. However, he was concerned about the potential for future conflicts between Jake and the Santos family. Mrs. Santos, Sheriff Bradley said, I'm going to increase patrols in this area for the next few weeks. I don't expect any more trouble, but I want to make sure everyone feels safe. Maria thanked the sheriff for his help and invited Diego and Linda Morrison into her house for coffee. She had been thinking about Linda's suggestion that Jake build his facility elsewhere, and she wanted to explore whether there might be a compromise that could satisfy everyone. Inside Maria's small but comfortable kitchen, the three of them sat around a wooden table that Carlos Santos had built 30 years earlier. The walls were covered with family photos and religious artwork that reflected Maria's deep faith and strong family values. "Linda," Maria said, "I appreciate your husband's interest in buying my land, but this place means everything to me. Carlos and I built our whole life here." Linda nodded understandingly. "I know, Maria. And I think I've been pushing Jake to pursue this the wrong way. Maybe there's a solution that doesn't require you to sell." Diego had been quietly listening to the conversation between the two older women. His engineering training had taught him to look for creative solutions to complex problems, and he was beginning to see some possibilities. "What if we could find a way for Mr. Morrison to build his facility without needing grandmother's land?" Diego asked. "Has anyone actually studied whether there might be alternative locations that would work just as well?" Linda admitted that Jake had been so focused on Maria's property that he hadn't seriously considered other options. The land dispute had become personal for him, and he had lost sight of the practical business considerations. As the three of them continued talking, Diego began sketching a rough map of the area on a napkin. His engineering education had included courses in land use planning, and he could see several locations on the Morrison ranch that might work for a processing facility. "Look," Diego said, pointing to his crude map, "if Mr. Morrison built the facility here, closer to the main road, it would actually be more convenient for truck traffic. And the elevation is better for drainage." Linda studied the map with growing excitement. She had always been more practical than her husband, and she could see the logic in Diego's suggestions. If Jake could be convinced to consider these alternatives, the whole conflict might be resolved. But convincing Jake Morrison to change his mind would not be easy. His pride had been wounded, and he was more determined than ever to get his way. The confrontation with Diego had only strengthened his resolve to acquire Maria's land, regardless of the cost. As evening approached, news of the incident began to spread throughout Cedar Falls. Sarah Chen's article would not be published until the next day, but word of mouth traveled fast in a small town. By dinner time, most people had heard some version of the story about Jake Morrison being knocked down by Maria Santos' grandson. The reactions varied depending on people's opinions of Jake. Some of his wealthy friends were outraged that he had been disrespected by someone they considered beneath him. But many of the working-class residents of Cedar Falls quietly enjoyed hearing that the arrogant rancher had been brought down a peg. At the Morrison Ranch, Jake sat in his study, nursing a whiskey and his wounded pride. He had already made several phone calls to business associates, trying to find ways to pressure the Santos family. But his plans for revenge would soon face obstacles he hadn't anticipated. Linda Morrison sat at their kitchen table, studying Diego's map and thinking about the future. She had always known that her husband could be stubborn and prideful, but today's incident had opened her eyes to just how destructive those traits could be. For the first time in their 20-year marriage, she was seriously considering taking action that would directly oppose her husband's wishes. The stage was set for the next chapter of this conflict, which would involve secrets being revealed, alliances being formed, and Jake Morrison learning that his actions had consequences far beyond anything he had imagined. The next morning, Jake Morrison woke up with a pounding headache and a bruised ego that hurt worse than any physical pain. He had spent most of the night drinking whiskey and making phone calls to his business contacts, trying to find ways to make life difficult for the Santos family. But, as he sat at his breakfast table, reading Sarah Chen's front-page article in the Cedar Falls Gazette, he realized that his problems were just beginning. The headline read, "Local rancher taken down by college student in land dispute." Sarah had written a balanced but damaging account of the incident, including quotes from witnesses who confirmed that Jake had thrown the first punch. The article also included background information about the ongoing conflict over Maria's property and suggestions that Jake had been using intimidation tactics against an elderly widow. Jake's face turned red as he read the article. His reputation as a tough, successful businessman was being destroyed by a young reporter who didn't understand how things really worked in this part of Texas. He crumpled up the newspaper and threw it across the kitchen, where it landed near the feet of his wife Linda. "This is unacceptable," Jake growled. "I'm going to sue that newspaper for defamation." Linda picked up the newspaper and read the article carefully. Unlike her husband, she found the reporting to be fair and accurate. Saracen had simply told the truth about what had happened, and the truth made Jake look bad because his behavior had been inexcusable. "Jake," Linda said quietly, "maybe instead of fighting the newspaper, you should think about apologizing to the Santos family." Jake stared at his wife in disbelief. "Apologize? Are you out of your mind? That punk kid humiliated me in front of my own men. I'm not apologizing to anyone." But Linda had made a decision during the sleepless night she had spent thinking about the previous day's events. She had watched her husband become increasingly bitter and aggressive over the past few months, and yesterday's incident had shown her how dangerous his attitude was becoming. "Jake, I went to see Maria Santos yesterday after you left. She's a good woman who just wants to keep the land where she raised her children. There's no reason this has to be a fight." Jake's anger shifted from the newspaper to his wife. "Since when do you make decisions about ranch business? I've been handling land deals since before you met me." "This isn't about business anymore," Linda replied firmly. "This is about you trying to bully people who don't deserve it. And I won't be part of it." Before Jake could respond, the phone rang. It was his lawyer, Robert Mitchell, calling with news that would make Jake's day even worse. "Jake, I've been reviewing the easement agreement for the Santos property," Robert said. "I think there might be a problem with how you've been using it." "What kind of problem?" Jake demanded. "Well, the agreement specifically states that the easement is for moving cattle, not for general vehicle access. And several witnesses told me you've been driving your truck on that path regularly, even when you're not moving cattle." Jake felt his blood pressure rising again. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying that if Mrs. Santos wanted to, she could file a lawsuit claiming that you've been violating the terms of the easement. And, given yesterday's incident, she might have grounds for a harassment claim as well." Jake hung up the phone without saying goodbye. Everything that could go wrong was going wrong, and he didn't understand how the situation had gotten so far out of his control. Meanwhile, at Maria's house, the Santos family was dealing with their own challenges. Diego had called his parents in San Antonio to tell them about the incident, and they were driving up to Cedar Falls to make sure their son and Diego's grandmother were safe. Miguel Santos, Maria's son and Diego's father, was a quiet man who worked as a supervisor at a construction company. He had inherited his mother's gentle nature, but he also had a strong protective instinct when it came to his family. The news that a wealthy rancher had tried to hit his son filled him with a cold anger that was far more dangerous than Jake Morrison's hot temper. "Mijo," Miguel said to Diego as they sat on Maria's front porch, "tell me exactly what happened yesterday." Diego recounted the entire incident, from Jake's racist comments to the moment when the rancher ended up on the ground. Miguel listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "And you're sure he said you people need to learn your place?" Miguel asked. "Yes, Papa. Everyone heard it. That's when I knew he wasn't just angry about the land." Miguel nodded grimly. He had experienced racism before in his construction work, but hearing that someone had directed such comments toward his family made him furious. However, unlike Jake Morrison, Miguel was a man who thought before he acted. "We need to talk to a lawyer," Miguel said. "Not to cause trouble, but to protect ourselves." Maria had been listening to the conversation from inside the house, and she came out to join her son and grandson. At 60 years old, she had seen enough conflict in her life, and she was tired of fighting with Jake Morrison. "Miguel," she said, "I don't want to sue anyone. I just want to live in peace on the land that your father left me." "Mama, I understand that," Miguel replied. "But this man is not going to leave you alone. Yesterday he tried to hit Diego. What's he going to try next?" As if in answer to Miguel's question, they heard the sound of several vehicles approaching on the dirt road. Looking up, they saw 3 pickup trucks belonging to the Morrison Ranch heading toward Maria's property. Diego stood up quickly, his muscles tense with anticipation. After yesterday's confrontation, he wasn't sure what Jake Morrison might try next. But, as the trucks got closer, he could see that Jake wasn't with them. Instead, the vehicles were driven by some of Jake's ranch hands, and they were moving slowly, almost hesitantly. The lead truck stopped at the edge of Maria's property, and Tom Rodriguez, Jake's foreman, got out. Tom was a 50-year-old Mexican-American man who had worked for the Morrison Ranch for 15 years. He was known throughout the area as an honest, hard-working man who treated everyone with respect. Tom walked slowly toward the house, his hat in his hands and his expression serious. When he reached the porch, he stopped and looked directly at Maria. "Mrs. Santos," Tom said formally, "I came to apologize for what happened yesterday. Mr. Morrison's behavior was wrong, and I'm ashamed that we didn't stop him before things got out of hand." Maria was surprised by Tom's visit. She had known him casually for years and had always respected him, but she hadn't expected him to take a stand against his boss. "Thank you, Tom," Maria replied. "That means a lot to me." Tom nodded and then turned to Diego. "Young man, I want you to know that what you did yesterday took courage. Mr. Morrison had no right to try to hit you, and you handled yourself well." Diego was equally surprised by Tom's words. He had expected Jake's employees to be hostile toward him, not supportive. "I didn't want any trouble," Diego said. "I was just trying to protect my family." "I know," Tom replied. "And that's exactly what you should have done." Miguel stepped forward, curious about what had brought Tom Rodriguez to his mother's house. "Tom, is there something else going on?" Tom looked uncomfortable, as if he was struggling with a difficult decision. Finally, he spoke again. "Mr. Santos, there's something you should know about Mr. Morrison's plans. He's been making phone calls, trying to cause problems for your family." "What kind of problems?" Miguel asked. "He's been calling people in the agricultural industry, trying to make sure Diego can't get a job after college. He's also been talking to county officials about finding building code violations on your property." Diego felt a chill run down his spine. He had worked hard for 4 years to earn his engineering degree, and the thought of Jake Morrison sabotaging his career was terrifying. Miguel's expression darkened. "Is that legal?" "Probably not," Tom admitted. "But Mr. Morrison has a lot of influence around here. He might be able to cause real problems for your family." Maria sank into a chair on the porch, suddenly, feeling much older than her 60 years. She had hoped that yesterday's incident would be the end of the conflict, but apparently Jake Morrison was just getting started. "Tom," Maria asked, "why are you telling us this? Won't you get in trouble with Mr. Morrison?" Tom was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Mrs. Santos, I've worked for the Morrison Ranch for 15 years. I've always respected Mr. Morrison as a businessman, even when I didn't like his methods. But what happened yesterday crossed a line." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "My own son is about Diego's age. If some older man tried to hit him for standing up for his family, I'd want to know about it. And if my boss was trying to ruin a young man's future out of spite, I'd want someone to warn that family." Miguel understood that Tom Rodriguez was taking a significant risk by sharing this information. Ranch foremen were well-paid positions in rural Texas, and Tom had a family to support. By speaking out against his boss, he was potentially sacrificing his livelihood. "Tom, we appreciate you telling us this," Miguel said. "But are you sure you want to get involved? We don't want you to lose your job because of our problems." Tom smiled sadly. "Mr. Santos, I already lost my job. Mr. Morrison fired me this morning when I told him I wouldn't help him harass your family." The Santos family exchanged shocked glances. They had never intended for their conflict with Jake Morrison to hurt innocent people like Tom Rodriguez. "That's terrible," Maria said. "You have a family to support." "Don't worry about me," Tom replied. "I've been thinking about starting my own business anyway. But I wanted to warn you about what Mr. Morrison is planning. and I wanted to tell you something else. Tom looked around to make sure no one else was listening, then spoke in a lower voice. Mrs. Santos, you're not the only person Mr. Morrison has tried to force off their land. There are 3 other families in the county who've had similar problems with him over the past 5 years. He's used lawsuits, harassment, and political pressure to get what he wants. Diego leaned forward with interest. Are any of those families willing to talk about what happened? I think so, Tom said. Especially if they knew they weren't alone in dealing with his behavior. Miguel was beginning to see possibilities that hadn't existed before. Tom, would you be willing to help us contact those families? Yes, Tom replied without hesitation. I think it's time someone stood up to Jake Morrison. He's been getting away with bullying people for too long. As Tom Rodriguez drove away with his fellow ranch hands, the Santos family sat on the porch in thoughtful silence. What had started as a simple land dispute was evolving into something much larger. Jake Morrison's attempt to intimidate them had backfired spectacularly, and now he was facing the possibility of multiple families uniting against his tactics. Inside the Morrison ranch house, Jake was about to receive news that would make him realize just how serious his situation had become. Linda Morrison had been making phone calls of her own, and what she had learned would force Jake to confront the possibility that his aggressive tactics might finally have consequences he couldn't escape. Linda Morrison sat in her car outside the office of attorney Patricia Hayes in downtown Cedar Falls, gathering courage for what she was about to do. Patricia was known as the best civil rights lawyer in the county, and Linda had called her that morning to arrange an emergency meeting. What Linda was about to reveal would change everything for her husband Jake, and she knew there would be no going back after this conversation. Patricia Hayes was a 45-year-old woman who had built her reputation defending people against exactly the kind of harassment that Jake Morrison specialized in. She had grown up poor in East Texas and had worked her way through law school by cleaning offices at night. Her success had made her wealthy, but she had never forgotten what it felt like to be powerless against people with money and influence. Mrs. Morrison, Patricia said as Linda entered her office, I have to admit I was surprised by your phone call. What can I do for you? Linda took a deep breath and pulled a manila folder from her purse. Miss Hayes, I have information about my husband's business practices that I think you need to see. For the next hour, Linda revealed secrets that she had kept for nearly 20 years of marriage. She showed Patricia documents that proved Jake had used intimidation, harassment, and questionable legal tactics to force at least 6 families to sell their land to him at below-market prices. The documents included copies of threatening letters that Jake had sent to property owners, records of frivolous lawsuits he had filed to pressure people into selling, and evidence that he had used his political connections to have building inspectors harass families who refused his offers. My husband is not a bad man, Linda said, tears forming in her eyes. But his success has made him believe that he can treat people however he wants. What happened yesterday with the Santos family was just the latest example. Patricia studied the documents carefully. As an experienced civil rights lawyer, she recognized the potential for multiple lawsuits against Jake Morrison. But she was puzzled about why Linda was bringing this information to her. Mrs. Morrison, why are you showing me this? You understand that this evidence could be used to file lawsuits against your husband? Linda nodded sadly. I know. But yesterday I watched my husband try to hit a young man who was just defending his family. And when Jake got knocked down, instead of being ashamed of his behavior, he started planning revenge. She paused, wiping tears from her eyes. I can't be married to a man who hurts innocent people. If he won't stop on his own, then maybe facing the consequences will make him change. Meanwhile, at Maria Santos' house, an impromptu meeting was taking place that would prove to be Jake Morrison's worst nightmare. Tom Rodriguez had contacted the 3 other families who had been harassed by Jake, and they had all agreed to come to Maria's house to share their stories. The first family was Robert and Susan Chen, elderly Chinese immigrants who had owned a small farm until Jake forced them to sell 3 years earlier. Their story was heartbreaking. Jake had filed a lawsuit claiming that their irrigation system was illegally diverting water from his property. The lawsuit was completely false, but fighting it in court would have cost the Chens more money than they had. They were forced to sell their farm to Jake for half its market value. The second family was James and Carol Wilson, an African-American couple who had owned a trucking business that competed with one of Jake's subsidiary companies. Jake had used his political connections to have their trucks subjected to constant inspections by the state transportation department. The harassment made it impossible for them to operate profitably, and they were eventually forced to sell their business and move away from Cedar Falls. The third family was David and Rebecca Martinez, whose family had owned a small ranch for 4 generations. Jake wanted their land to expand his cattle operation, but they refused to sell. Jake had responded by filing complaints with the county claiming that their property had environmental problems. The complaints triggered expensive inspections and legal requirements that the Martinez family couldn't afford. They lost their ranch to foreclosure when they couldn't pay the costs of complying with unnecessary environmental regulations. As these families shared their stories with the Santos family, a pattern emerged. Jake Morrison's methods were always just legal enough to avoid criminal charges, but they caused devastating financial and emotional damage to his victims. He targeted families who didn't have the resources to fight back, and he used the legal system as a weapon against people who couldn't afford to defend themselves. Miguel Santos listened to each story with growing anger. How has he gotten away with this for so long, he asked. Because his victims were isolated, explained James Wilson. Each family thought they were dealing with their problems alone. We never realized that other people were going through the same thing. Diego had been taking notes throughout the meeting, his engineering training helping him analyze the patterns in Jake's behavior. What if we weren't isolated anymore, he asked. What if all the families worked together? Tom Rodriguez, who had been quiet during most of the meeting, suddenly spoke up. There's something else you all should know. Mrs. Morrison came to see Mrs. Santos yesterday, and she seemed really upset about her husband's behavior. Maria nodded. Linda Morrison is a good woman. I think she's been trying to control her husband's temper for years. Maybe she would be willing to help us, suggested Rebecca Martinez. If Mrs. Morrison provided evidence about her husband's methods, it would make our cases much stronger. Unknown to the family's meeting at Maria's house, Linda Morrison was at that very moment providing exactly that evidence to Patricia Hayes. The lawyer was already planning a coordinated legal strategy that would expose all of Jake's tactics and seek justice for his victims. Back at the Morrison Ranch, Jake was having the worst day of his professional life. 3 of his longtime ranch hands had quit that morning, following Tom Rodriguez's lead in refusing to participate in harassment activities. Jake's banker had called to express concern about the negative publicity from the newspaper article. And 2 of his business partners had suggested that maybe it was time for Jake to consider stepping back from day-to-day operations. But the worst blow came when Jake's lawyer Robert Mitchell called with devastating news. Jake, I just got a call from Patricia Hayes' office. She's representing the Santos family, and she wants to meet tomorrow to discuss a settlement. Jake's blood pressure spiked. Patricia Hayes was known throughout Texas as a lawyer who didn't settle cases unless she had overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing. A settlement for what? Jake demanded. That punk kid assaulted me. Jake, Robert said carefully, I think you need to prepare for the possibility that this is about more than yesterday's incident. Patricia Hayes doesn't take cases unless she thinks she can win them. As the reality of his situation began to sink in, Jake Morrison felt something he had never experienced in his adult life: genuine fear. For decades, he had used money, influence, and intimidation to get whatever he wanted. But now he was facing an opponent who couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated. That evening, Linda Morrison returned home to find her husband sitting in his study, staring at a glass of whiskey. For the first time since she had known him, Jake Morrison looked defeated. Linda, Jake said without looking up, I think I'm in real trouble. Linda sat down across from her husband, her heart breaking despite her anger at his behavior. Jake, it doesn't have to be this way. You could still make this right. How? Jake asked. Half the county hates me now. My own employees are quitting. And, apparently some hotshot lawyer thinks she can destroy me. Linda took a deep breath and prepared to tell her husband what she had done. Jake, Patricia Hayes isn't just some random lawyer. I hired her. Jake's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. You what? I gave her documents that show how you've been treating people for the past 20 years. I couldn't watch you hurt any more families. For a moment, Jake was too stunned to speak. His own wife had betrayed him and handed ammunition to his enemies. It was the ultimate humiliation in a week full of humiliations. But, as the initial shock wore off, Jake began to feel something unexpected: relief. For 20 years, he had carried the weight of his guilty conscience, telling himself that his methods were just business. Having his secrets exposed was terrifying, but it also meant he didn't have to carry those secrets anymore. Linda, Jake said quietly, what happens now? Now you have a choice, Linda replied. You can try to fight this and probably lose everything, including your family. Or you can admit what you've done and try to make amends. 3 days later, Patricia Hayes arranged a meeting at the Cedar Falls Community Center that would be remembered as one of the most significant events in the town's history. All of Jake Morrison's victims were there, along with their families and supporters. Local media, including Sarah Chen from the Cedar Falls Gazette, were present to document what happened. Jake Morrison entered the community center looking like a man who had aged 10 years in 1 week. He was accompanied by his wife Linda and his lawyer Robert Mitchell. As he walked to the front of the room, he could feel the eyes of everyone watching him. Patricia Hayes had prepared a comprehensive presentation that detailed Jake's pattern of harassment and intimidation. But, before she could begin, Jake Morrison stood up. Ms. Hayes, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper, I'd like to speak first, if that's okay. For the next 30 minutes, Jake Morrison did something he had never done in his adult life: he admitted he was wrong. He apologized to each family individually, acknowledging the specific ways he had hurt them. He agreed to pay financial compensation that would more than cover their losses. And he committed to changing his business practices completely. I know that saying I'm sorry doesn't undo the damage I've caused, Jake said, tears forming in his eyes. But I want everyone to know that the man who hurt your families is not the man I want to be anymore. Maria Santos was the first person to speak after Jake's statement. The elderly woman stood slowly and looked directly at the man who had tried to destroy her family. Mr. Morrison, Maria said in her gentle voice, my husband Carlos used to say that a man's character is not determined by his mistakes, but by how he responds when he realizes he has made them. What you did to these families was wrong, but what you are doing today takes courage. One by one, the other families expressed their willingness to accept Jake's apology and work with him to rebuild trust in the community. It would take time and consistent actions to prove that his change was genuine, but they were willing to give him that chance. Diego Santos watched the proceedings with a mixture of satisfaction and amazement. 1 week ago, he had been a college student planning to start his career. Now he was part of a group that had brought down one of the most powerful men in the county and forced him to acknowledge years of wrongdoing. But Diego was wise enough to understand that the real victory was not in Jake Morrison's humiliation. The real victory was in the community coming together to support families who had been hurt and to establish that wealth and influence could not protect someone from the consequences of harmful behavior. As the meeting ended and people began to leave the community center, Jake Morrison found himself standing alone except for his wife Linda. The man who had started the week believing he could intimidate anyone was ending it humbled and uncertain about his future. Jake, Linda said, taking his hand, I'm proud of what you did today. It was the hardest thing you've ever done, but it was also the most important. Jake nodded, still processing everything that had happened. Linda, do you think people will ever forgive me? Some will, some won't, Linda replied honestly. But what matters is that you forgive yourself and work every day to be the man you should have been all along. 6 months later, the transformation of Jake Morrison was complete. He had built his new cattle processing facility on a different part of his ranch, using the location that Diego Santos had suggested. The facility was actually more efficient than it would have been on Maria's land, and it employed several people from families that Jake had previously harmed. Maria Santos still lived on her 20 acres, where she had established a small organic garden that supplied vegetables to the local farmers market. Diego had graduated from college and taken a job with a company that specialized in sustainable agricultural engineering. His first project was helping design improvements to Jake Morrison's ranch that made it more environmentally friendly and profitable. Tom Rodriguez had started his own successful ranch management company and was now one of the most respected businessmen in Cedar Falls. Several of his former co-workers from the Morrison Ranch had joined his company, and they specialized in helping ranchers develop land use strategies that benefited both business and community. The story of Jake Morrison's fall and redemption became a legend in Cedar Falls, but not in the way that Jake had originally wanted to be remembered. Instead of being feared as a ruthless businessman who always got his way, he became known as an example of how people could change when they were forced to confront the consequences of their actions. And Diego Santos, the young man who had knocked down a powerful rancher with a simple defensive move, became a symbol of how standing up for what is right can change not only your own life, but the lives of an entire community.